Good evening. Welcome to the first player development webinar for 2017 at Ontario Soccer, which is the Let the Game Be the Teacher and the GAG methodology. I'll be joined tonight by Billy Wilson, who's the Manager of Player Development at Ontario Soccer, and Sonia Cavello, who is the Regional Manager of Player Development. I'm Dave Kelly. I'm also the Regional Manager in the Player Development Department at Ontario Soccer, and I'll be taking you primarily through the webinar this evening. Just want to start by talking about the upcoming player development webinars. A month from now, on the 15th of March, we've got the Blocked versus Random Practices webinar. That's with Billy Wilson. On the 26th of April, we've got the Why Kids Quit Sports webinar. This is a special guest joining us. It'll be John O'Sullivan. Those of you familiar with John's Changing the Game project, we expect a huge attendance for that, so please make sure that we sign up early. Then following that, we've got Incorporating Physical Literacy. Again, that'll be done by Billy Wilson. That's on the 10th of May. And finishing off, we have Dr. Tracy Valancourt from the University of Ottawa, and she'll be presenting on the psychosocial development of grassroots players. Obviously a range of topics there. Again, we appreciate you joining us, and we hope that you can take the time to join us in the upcoming webinars. So we'll begin with asking a question, and I'm pretty sure that everybody who's joined us this evening will answer yes to this question, but we're starting off. Who would like their players to be better decision makers, better in all different areas of the model, technically, tactically, socially, emotionally, and also physically? Who wants the players to enjoy every single session? And then finally, who wants the players to keep returning season after season? We hope the answer to that is all of you. And again, what we're going to look at tonight is a methodology of how we can go about that. So just covering what we're going to be looking at in the different stages. We're going to look at what is GAG and the methodology. We're going to look at why it's important for player development, what are the benefits, how do we execute the GAG methodology, and also how do we incorporate it into the player development model, which we're incorporating and which we are advocating for at Ontario Soccer. So starting off, looking at letting the game be the teacher, we'll ask about what is GAG? What is the GAG methodology? So at first, it stands for Global Analytical. Global, the different parts of the session, is quite commonly referred to as game, activity, a game. And also in learning styles and learning processes, it's also been referred to as the whole part whole way of learning. So how you may practice a skill and then you then break it down and then practice it again in the full version. So just going to spend a moment to look at a little bit more in depth about what GAG looks like. Firstly, we've got it's a methodology and a philosophy on how to approach learning. The game is the center point of the focus, so everything's in context to the game. So when we're working with players, making stoppages, interventions, and teaching moments, coaching moments, we're showing the players in game context. Again, the methodology is fun, it's exciting and challenging for youth players, so it gives them motivation. They know that they're going to come to training, they're going to spend a lot of time in games, which is obviously why players want to play. They want to play in the games. Also falls in lines with different dimensions of learning and helps with different stages as they're going through. And it also tests players cognitively, because within GAG sessions there's always decisions to be made, because the majority of the time, and the vast majority of the time, there's always decisions to be made based on players playing against opponents rather than unopposed work. So we're going to look at the overall picture of GAG first of all, and we will delve into that a little bit deeper a little later on. But the first part we've got is the warm-up. Really easy, at the start of every session, the warm-up, again, no common sense here, probably warm-up is related to the theme of the session that you're going to be working on. The next part, phase 2, that's where it's broken down into 3 parts. We've got the global, So it's a game situation to set the scene. The coach might introduce a topic. That might be something where you start your session, you're envisaging working on passing. You might show a demonstration of passing. You might have access to a video quickly to show the players from the pro level about what good passing looks like. So it's just an introduction to the topic, and then you're letting players play a small-sided game. Then we have the analytical part. This is where players are placed into an activity which increases the number of repetitions that you covering. So again, if we're looking at passing, this analytical stage will allow players to make more decisions. So it's an increased number of passes, increased number of decisions. And decision making is crucial when looking at technique. I know Billy Wilson will cover this in more detail in his next webinar, but it's very important that players are making decisions when executing the technique. And then at this point, again, the coach gets the opportunity to really get in and work with the players and maybe break down the finer details of the technique to allow them to succeed. And again, obviously using a different variety of coaching styles. And then we have the global section, the final global. This is where players are put into a game situation and are free to make decisions. So this game would be realistic to a normal game, normal rules, and so on. And this gives the coach a chance and opportunity to observe what the players have learned and kind of take a step back and maybe make a few notes, and also giving them maybe a preview of what is to come in the game day to show what the players have learned. Finally, then finish off with phase 3, so cool down, which again most coaches do that, making sure the players are cooled down. And then at that point, they can go over assessment of the learning and maybe have a quick word with the final thoughts and observations based on the game, and maybe some adjustments or some takeaways for the players to think about coming into the next training session or game. So now we need to look at why is GAG important, and this is the picture that we're facing currently in Ontario at the moment. So as you can see at the bottom of this diagram, we've got players who are 4 to 5 years old. We've got a vast amount of players there. But as we start to transition through to the age of 12, 70% of our players are leaving the game of soccer, which is obviously a huge amount and a huge concern. But by 12 years old, 70% of those 4 and 5 year olds are not playing anymore. One of the main reasons that the players give is that it's no longer fun. So we can interpret that in different ways, but again, when we're looking at this methodology, players are coming to play, they're coming to learn. So we're looking at a methodology which incorporates all of the players' expectations. So I've got here a quote from McGill in 2006 on motor learning, and their explanation here is the transfer of practice to game conditions depends on the extent to which the practice resembles the game. I think this is very, very important, that when we are expecting players to be able to pass efficiently or dribble correctly or score goals, they can only really do that in a game if they've been practicing that in a game setting. So this comes to our next point quite nicely with the player expectation. A lot of players will come to training, you look at the picture on the left, expecting to score the winning goal for Canada in the World Cup, as we can see Christine Sinclair doing there. Unfortunately, for a lot of players, the reality is that they are faced with an activity, or old school word, a drill, where they are just asked to dribble through cones, no decisions being made, a lot of time trying to execute the same technique, and the environment that they were experiencing was very, very different to the game. Obviously, the cones don't even move. There's no body shape on them, and so there's a lot less stimulus for players to read in order to make better decisions. And unfortunately, after all of that was done, traditionally just 10% of training was in a game setting. So thinking back to maybe years ago when we were younger and we played, we were excited to come to training, and really were excited for the final, for the game at the end. And only 10% of that was training, and remembering the disappointment that we might have felt when we didn't get as long training time because we were spending longer on the activities. So we can look at that now, and we're going to use the example of a player dribbling through cones. and just looking at some alternatives to how we can relate our training sessions to the real game. So the first activity here we've got is all the players have got a ball each, and they're dribbling around the circle. This activity is called King of the Ring, Queen of the Ring, or whatever. As what players are asked to do is not only maintain control of their own ball, but to try and touch or kick the ball out of the circle of the teammates. Rather than traditionally this being done where it was an elimination game and a player might sat out, what we'd say then is a player would be asked to do a skill move to re-enter. Again, it might be a skill move that you've showed them earlier prior. It might be some keep-ups, toe taps. It might even just be running with the ball around the circle before they can re-enter. But again, making sure that when those players are in the middle of the activity, they're always looking around, they're scanning, and they're moving the ball and their body based on the environment and based on the other players in the area. The next one here, and I'm going to touch on this in a little bit more detail later on, is just a very simple 1v1 activity where the server who's in yellow might pass the ball to a player in tangerine. They'll then take on a defender 1v1 and look to get a shot off on goal. At that point, all the players would rotate. So the goalkeeper becomes the server becomes the attacker becomes the defender, and the defender becomes the goalkeeper. So again, allowing the players to have a look at the defender's position, maybe deciding do they take the shot early, do they see space in behind to beat the player and get a shot off at goal. So again, looking a little bit more realistic pictures to what they would face in the game on the left, in contrast to what you see on the right. And just another one here, very simple one. If we look at the players on the right in tangerine, starting at B1, they'll play the ball forward to B2. You can see there the coach is holding two different colours behind the player with B2. So as the ball receives, they might just quickly check the shoulder and call out the colour of the player. Then they play the ball into B3. Maybe would run, dribble past a mannequin or a defender even better, and then shoot at goal. So again, giving players different focus, giving players different challenges as they're going through, and hopefully again relating this to a game. The progression for that after the player was shot on the goal, they would then become a recovering defender in transition. So then we get the 1v1 scenario. So again, making sure it's more realistic, and obviously you can't see that in the diagram there, but also importance of adding a goalkeeper when shooting on goal. So what did the CSA want from our players? I've got a quote here from Sean Fleming, who's the national staff coach at the CSA. And what he said is that they've coming through to him and the system would be that the players need to be more game savvy. And what they're facing is players who, from other countries, who play every single day on the street. And we need our training environments to try and reflect that, and in order to help them play as many games as possible. As you know, in Ontario, we face a number of different challenges with the climate, with the indoor facilities in the winter where players can't go out and play out on the streets because of the snow or the cold conditions with everything iced over. So again, in the training environments that they come to, how can we get our players to be more game savvy? How can we give our players a better understanding? I know as well it's important that when the players are at school, after they come from school, they normally come straight to our training environments. They might miss games, the Champions League games, or get very limited access to them, or live soccer on TV. So how can we emulate that in our training environments? How can we teach the game to players to give them that understanding of what the pros do, or how to receive based on where a defender is? So it's really important, and that's what's coming through from the top of what we need to do to ensure we're creating and developing better players. So here we see the benefits, and I've split the benefits up into different sections. We've got the psychological benefits, and all these are the benefits to GAG, and the main one is its real soccer actions. So on the psychological side, it'll give players an increase in confidence. If the player has faced a scenario in training a number of times, they will feel more confident. The self-esteem will increase when being faced with the same scenario in a competitive setting. Again, that gives them increased game experience. They're able to understand if, for example, they didn't execute something correctly, how to change that. Is it the position, the movement, the direction, or the speed? So it gives them more game experience and also less likely to consider external factors. So from a psychological experience, a psychological perspective, players will start then to think, rather than considering things might have been unlucky, or it was the referee's fault, or the field was too long, or so on and so forth, they might actually start thinking more about the technique and more about soccer actions than they would external factors, making the players a lot stronger and a lot more confident psychologically. The technical and tactical benefits of GAG are huge. The first one, again, it's more soccer actions. So we're increasing the amount of soccer actions, especially on the small-sided games, than they would on the bigger games or in isolated technical activities. There's more decisions to be made because they are experiencing different scenarios every time the ball moves. No scenario really is the same. You might have a few which are similar, but no scenario is exactly the same. So players are always constantly making new decisions. Again, that helps with the technical execution in games. So if we compare this to earlier to the isolated exercises, players are taught how to do one technique particularly. But again, in a small-sided game, it might be a different technique depending on where the defender might be. It might be, rather than a driven ball, you might go for a curved pass, for instance. And the final and probably the most important part in this section is the teaching with these four aspects. So when we're helping or improving a player or correcting a player in a small-sided game, the four things need to be considered for every soccer action. Where is the position on the field? Where is the position of the opponent? What's the starting movement? Are they starting on a run? Are they starting still with the ball to feet? The direction of the movement or the direction of the pass. Is it on the front foot? Is it on the back foot? And then the speed of the action as well. So every time we make a correction, we really must consider those four aspects, which again we can only really recreate in a game-like setting. Moving forward to the physical benefits of the GAG methodology, obviously more ball rolling time, so the players are then getting soccer-specific conditioning. So the players are asked to make soccer-specific movements, so whether that would be dropping off, turning to receiving, whether that might be supporting a player from deep, whether it might be an overlapping run, underlapping run, or a striker running along the line. They're getting that soccer-specific conditioning and movements within the game context, and again making it more realistic than they would if we're just recreating that artificially in an isolated exercise. And the final part, which is also important, is the social. I know at grassroots ages we get asked questions about how we can increase communication. The more the players play alongside each other, the better the communication will be. So if you put them in game situations where they are able to work alongside and work together in those game situations, obviously they get more experience with that and they get used to which players receive off which foot and so on and so forth. And that builds communication and it builds a better rapport. And finally, players want to play games with their friends and their teammates. In training environments, they might feel a little bit more safe to execute, to play 1v1, to try something that they've seen in a game without the repercussions maybe of the parents watching and so on and so forth. So again, from a social perspective, players want to play games with their friends or their teammates. So as mentioned, there are a number of benefits, the main one being the real soccer actions. It's player-centered, the players get to make decisions and solve problems. It's fun, players want to play. Coaches also are able to see the whole picture and recreate scenarios which are happening in games. And then soccer action actually increases and equals soccer training. So you're improving players to improve in soccer actions, they will then improve more directly towards a game. So we're going to look at a little bit more detailed about how we execute GAG. This table coming up now, this came from FIFA. and FIFA Grassroots. Again, shows the phase 1 of the warm-up. Again, spending around 10 to 15 minutes on this. As you can see, the activities there showing technical exercises, introductory games, small-sided games, and obviously there at that point just getting the players warmed up and focused. Phase 2, as we've mentioned, will start with a small-sided game, introductory game. This could be 2v2s, 3v3s, or anything like that, which allows the players again to make decisions with a direction, maybe defending one goal to scoring another goal, or defending one end zone to scoring another. Moving on, we've got the basic football technique. So we've got an increase there where you can increase the number of repetitions. So again, if you're looking at passing or dribbling, this would be where you're picking an activity where there are defenders and there's opposition, but players, you maybe might break the players down into smaller groups, smaller numbers, so they can have a number of goals and an increased number of repetitions at the technique. Obviously, the increased number of repetitions might lead to an increased number of mistakes or learning opportunities, and that's where as a coach you can really get into the details of how to help the players and how to improve the players. So once we've done that, we can go into this small-sided game, go back out into the bigger picture, free play for the normal rules that you'd play on a game day, and allow players to make decisions. And again, as mentioned before, this is where coaches, rather than stepping in and intervening, would start maybe to be thinking a little bit more about how the players are learning and start more from an assessment point of view. In the initial game, in the small-sided game, and at the start of the phase 2, then for sure coaches go in, stop, make points, make corrections, but for the final game, encouraging players to let them play. And finally, the phase 3, as we've mentioned, the cool down, where players can recover, relax, maybe do some meditation, breathing exercises, and then also maybe a little bit of a recap of the learning and setting targets, possibly for the next training session or the next game. So I just want to take a while to get you to think, or just take a moment to pause here and give you the chance to think about our biggest mistake. That isolated training exercises that don't involve decision making are not explicitly linked to the game. So then we're actually expecting players after doing these exercises which don't involve opponents or decision making to automatically succeed at a much more advanced difficulty level when it gets put into a game. So the question that I've got for you is, how can we manipulate the game to create repetitions of the technique that we want to work on during the session? So I want you to take a minute, maybe note down, if you have the opportunity, to what ideas you have to how we can manipulate the game to create repetitions of technique. So we've got some ideas here. We'll start in the different sections of the GAG. So we might begin with a warm-up of a physical literacy focus. Again, one of our webinars in the future will be covering on physical literacy, so please have a look at that. We have got a lot of information more on physical literacy and its significance. I know recently at the Canadian Sport for Life conference, they talked about physical literacy now with decision making, rather than just focusing on general movements. I'll try and encourage decision making. So this is an activity we came up with here, where we've got 4 players on the outside, all with a ball each, and players attempt to dribble across the square to the other side. If they do that, they get 2 points. If they dribble just to the closest side, they get 1 point. And the idea is that they avoid being tagged by the player in the middle, the defender in the middle. If they get tagged, then 3 times, then they swap over and they become the player in the middle. So again, encouraging players to have a look, assess the space, the speed, the time, changes of direction, change of movement. So obviously this session may be a little bit more focused on, this warm-up might be more focused on a session for dribbling, but really encouraging players to start getting to making those decisions as early as possible in the warm-up. The next, we've got some activities for an initial game. So the first one you can see on the left is a 7v7 game. Might just literally simply just be move the offside lines to further away to the retreat line to allow for dispersal. We can also adapt this as well the 7v7 game to have target players. So rather than having goalkeepers in goals, the players in the green there could be target players to receive. If you're looking more at passing or penetration or so on. Again, you could have end zones. That might be more if you're just focusing on the technique of dribbling, asking the players to dribble in the end zones. 4-goal games if you're looking at changing the angle of attack or multi-directional and so on and so forth. So the initial game, you can again change the rules to increase the repetition of the technique that you want to work on. Alternatively, you can see on the right, we can also increase the number of repetitions by reducing the numbers and obviously the field size as well. So setting up a 3v3 and a 4v4 game, as you can see here. The only thing we'd mention on here is be careful not to play for too long. The more you reduce the players, the more soccer actions per minute players are asked to make, which obviously increases the level of fatigue. So be very, very careful when playing 3v3 and 4v4 that we don't play for too long. Obviously, we want the intensity to be very, very high in those games. So what we'd advise is a couple of minutes where they play 2 minutes maximum, then maybe a rest, and then keep going. So then you're keeping the level of intensity high and giving the players frequent breaks as well. So here we've got ideas for an analytical game. And this is something we touched upon earlier. So the first one you can see here, the yellow player, the server, will play the ball into the tangerine player, who's the attacker. The blue player will look to recover here from the left, and then the attacker will look to finish and shoot on goal. Then we can see rather than the defender coming from the left, the defender comes from the right. And again, making sure, just to emphasize, that after each of these actions, players are rotating. So the server becomes the attacker becomes the defender becomes the goalkeeper becomes the server. But now straight away we're starting to think about the different angles that the players come from. The next one we can see, which is probably the more traditional one, where the striker receives the ball and the defender is coming directly in front of them. I know this is one that's practiced over and over again, but considering the different angles that the players pressure from in a game, how can we make sure that we recreate this in our training scenario? And as you can see there, the final one, the defender is recovering from behind. So maybe the dribbler or the receiving player or the attacker is starting to thinking about taking the touch so they can cut off the defender's recovery line and goal to goal and get a shot. Another one here, which again might work for penetrating passes. It worked for running with the ball, where the teams in the end zones move the ball, and when the player sees an opportunity, they can dribble across to the opposite end zone. The players in the middle may be doing some ball mastery work. Again, this could be set up if you've got 2 coaches. One coach working with running with the ball with the blue and the tangerine players, and maybe an assistant coach working with a bit more ball mastery with the yellow players, and encouraging them to move around the area so the environment is always changing. So the players, when they're receiving the ball, are making a decision. They'll have space to penetrate and go forward, whether it's with a pass or whether it's with a run. So once we've worked on the analytical, this is where we'd go to the final game activity. So this is where we really let them play. Again, we apply all the rules for realism, whatever is age appropriate, throw-ins, kick-ins, corners, offsides. Make sure the rules replicate the game that the players are familiar with on a game day. Also, we've got the coach reflection time. In the game here, are the players executing what you have done with them in the session? Was the session effective? What did they learn? If we do need maybe adjustments, that might be something, if they have a water break within that time, maybe ask them to focus them a little bit more for sure. But what we wouldn't advise is coaching and over-coaching. Let the players play, let them make decisions, and then you can see how effective your session has been. And again, just a final point is making sure that the realism is there. So if you play with retreat lines and so on, make sure they are included in your training sessions. So now we'll want to just really quickly look at the GAG methodology and how it works with the player development model and how it all fits in together. So we need to obviously establish what the player development model is for those that don't know. So that might be where you've got a lot of groups of players, groups of coaches. Station work is the main structure of the activities, where everybody's together in one location with stations, making sure it's fun, it's player-centred, and the players have an opportunity to work with different coaches, and every player in the age group can work and experience the same level, and everybody has access to the same level of resources and same level as coaching. This slide just kind of covers what it is. This one might be where there's 8 players in total. We have one coach with a 45-minute training session, and we break that down into different stations. So on this next slide here, you can see how we've got the visual of that. We've got 4 different stations, where if they start at station 1, they might do a physical literacy activity, U8 for example, and station 2 they'll move to a small-sided game. So here straight away we're seeing the structure to the GAG. You might see the first part being the warm-up, the second part being the game activity. Then you move to station 3, which would be an initial activity, it would be an analytical activity where players are forced to increase repetitions, and then station 4 would be a small-sided game. So within the player development model, all players have the opportunity to experience and make decisions, but the GAG methodology also fits in very, very nicely with that. They might not necessarily do it in that order. They might start with a game, then they might start with go to a physical literacy activity, then a game, and then a technical activity after that. But again, they're all experiencing different parts, and they're all experiencing decisions which are being made. We often get asked about the player development model because some clubs have a lot of players. So this is something we've drawn out here where we have 100 players. You've got 10 stations. You might have 20 coaches, 2 coaches per station. And then again, if you look and follow it through, they might start on an activity at station 1, go to a small-sided game, then to a technical activity, and then finish up with a game. And again, it can rotate rounds. So all players are doing that. So this is really how GAG fits into the player development model. Fits in really nicely because again, they're jumping from activity to game and activity to game. So important. So finally, I just want to finish off with our final thoughts or our takeaways that GAG is a methodology that allows players to learn by playing the game. It's easily incorporated into the player development model. GAG is not just letting them play with no instruction. So we're not just throwing the balls on the field and crossing our arms saying, okay, you can play. Teaching and learning still must take place, especially in the initial game and especially in the analytical. Creating an environment with more decision making and more game realism in contrast to traditional models. And again, making it more enjoyable for players. More fun, more decisions to be made, more competition within training, and then again, more likely to return season after season. So finally, just want to finish with a reminder of our upcoming player development webinars. On the 15th of March, we've got our blocked versus random practice with Billy Wilson. And then we've got our special guest, John O'Sullivan, looking at why kids quit sports on the 26th of April. Following that, Billy Wilson again incorporating physical literacy. As mentioned during this webinar, is physical literacy with decision making is very, very important. So Billy will be presenting on that, giving you a lot more detail and information. And then finally, finishing off with our final guest speaker of the year, with Dr. Tracy Valancourt from the University of Ottawa, who will present on the psychosocial development of grassroots players. So a lot to look forward to in 2017. Thank you for taking the time to join us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you at future webinars from Ontario Soccer.
If you've got any questions on tonight's webinar, please feel free to ask in the questions box. Billy, Sonia and I will be sticking around and answering them, so feel free on anything that's covered. Also feel free to contact us on the email address on the screen, or contact me at Coach Dave Kelly via Twitter if you're interested in any other player development resources we offer at Ontario Soccer. If not, thank you for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.